Millionaire thought he was trapped in an arranged marriage, until the bride removed her veil. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The ballroom was a masterpiece of chandeliers and marble floors, filled with the finest silk gowns and tuxedos money could buy. Yet at the center of it all stood a man who looked like a prisoner. Alexander Reed, heir to one of the largest conglomerates in the country, was not smiling on his wedding day. His jaw was set, his eyes cold, as if every guest could see the invisible chains binding him to a contract he never wanted. He had always believed marriage should be a choice, not a business transaction. But tonight, choice was a luxury denied to him. The merger between the Reed family empire and the Monroe financial dynasty depended on this union. Refuse, and thousands of jobs would be lost, billions of dollars at stake. Agree, and he would live the rest of his life with a stranger. As the orchestra played the opening notes of the bridal march, whispers rose among the guests. Who was the mysterious bride? Few had ever seen her. Rumor said she was a Monroe daughter raised overseas. Some believed she had been educated in Paris. Others whispered about her perfect pedigree. Yet behind the veil, there was silence. Alexander's eyes flicked to the aisle, and there she was, small in frame but carrying herself with a grace that held the entire room. The veil covered her features, but her steps were steady. She did not falter even once, though the weight of hundreds of eyes pressed down on her. Inside, Alexander's thoughts were anything but calm. Another pawn in a game I never agreed to play, he told himself. His hand tightened at his side, resisting the urge to tear the ring from his pocket and hurl it away. But then he caught sight of his father's stern face, and the board of directors lined up like vultures in the front row. His freedom was not just his own anymore. It was tied to the fate of an empire. The bride reached the altar. She did not speak. She only lowered her head slightly, and Alexander caught the faintest glimpse of trembling fingers beneath her bouquet. For a split second, he wondered if she was just as trapped as he was. The officiant began the ceremony. Each word sounded like iron gates closing. "Do you, Alexander Reed, take this woman?" His voice boomed through the hall, echoing against marble walls. Alexander's throat tightened, but he forced the words out. "I do." Gasps and applause filled the room, but his heart felt heavier with every cheer. Then came her turn. The bride's voice was soft, almost breaking, but clear enough for all to hear. "I do." The applause was louder this time, and with it, the deal was sealed. Papers had been signed weeks ago, lawyers had drawn up every clause, and now the contract was bound by rings and vows. To the world, this was the perfect union. To Alexander, it was nothing more than a gilded cage. But then, just as the final blessing was spoken, just as he prepared to endure the first kiss of duty rather than desire, something happened that froze him in place. The bride lifted her veil, and in that instant, everything Alexander thought he knew about this marriage, about his future, about the woman standing before him, changed forever. The sound of applause faded, but Alexander Reed barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the young woman who had just removed her veil. She was not the polished aristocrat he had been led to expect. There was no trace of the cold arrogance usually found in the Monroe lineage. Instead, her features held a quiet determination, her eyes steady, though her fingers still trembled. He had spent weeks preparing to despise this woman, telling himself she was nothing more than a symbol of a merger, a signature on a dotted line. Yet when he saw her face, he felt an unexpected shift inside him, a question rising that he could not silence. Who exactly was this bride that his family had forced upon him? The rest of the evening unfolded like a theater performance. The photographers swarmed, guests lined up to offer congratulations, champagne glasses clinked, and the orchestra played. Alexander went through the motions, his arm around her shoulder, his lips forming polite words of gratitude. To the world, they were the perfect couple. To him, it was an act scripted long before he stepped onto that aisle. Hours later, when the last guest had departed and the mansion returned to silence, the truth revealed itself. Papers were waiting on his desk. The marriage contract, already signed by both families, sat inside a leather folder embossed with golden letters. Each clause was written in exacting detail. Public appearances must be maintained. Divorce permitted only after 1 year. No personal scandals allowed. Alexander flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. His new wife sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, the wedding gown replaced by a modest ivory dress. She did not speak, not until he finally looked at her and asked, "Do you even know what you have agreed to?" Her voice was soft but firm. "Yes, I understand." He studied her carefully. "Then you should also understand this. I will honor the agreement, but nothing more. Do not expect affection. Do not expect love. This marriage is a performance for the world, nothing else." A flicker of something passed across her eyes, not pain, not anger, but something deeper. She nodded slowly. "I never asked for anything else." Her words struck him unexpectedly, but he ignored the feeling. He returned the contract to its folder and pushed it aside. "Very well. We keep up appearances, and in a year we part ways. That is all." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not empty. Alexander noticed the way she kept her back straight, the way she refused to show weakness, even in this suffocating arrangement. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. That night, as the city lights flickered through the tall windows of the Reed estate, two strangers sat beneath the same roof, bound not by choice but by ink on a contract. One believed he was shackled, the other carried secrets that could change everything. And though Alexander convinced himself this was only business, a small voice inside whispered that nothing about this woman would stay hidden for long. The first weeks of marriage moved like clockwork, rehearsed and polished for the public eye. Alexander and his bride appeared together at charity galas, boardroom dinners, and even a televised interview where their smiles looked convincing enough to silence the press. Yet behind closed doors, their silence spoke louder than words. In the mansion's long hallways, Alexander kept his distance. He buried himself in endless meetings, business trips, and contracts that had nothing to do with the one signed on his wedding day. When he was home, he dined alone in his private study, leaving her to eat quietly in the vast dining room. It was as if two worlds coexisted under the same roof, parallel but never touching. Still, whispers began to spread. Staff members noticed the coldness between them. Journalists, hungry for scandal, started to question why the couple never displayed genuine warmth. Paparazzi photographs showed him stepping into cars without offering her a hand, or walking ahead while she trailed behind. To the public, it began to look less like a fairy tale and more like an arrangement. One evening, as a storm lashed against the tall glass windows, Alexander returned from a late meeting to find her sitting by the fireplace. She was sketching in a small, worn notebook, the kind of object that looked out of place in a house filled with expensive leather-bound volumes. Curious despite himself, he asked, "What are you drawing?" She closed the book quickly, almost defensively. "Nothing important." His brows lifted slightly. "You hide things well. Perhaps that is why my family chose you." Her eyes met his, steady despite his coldness. "Or perhaps they chose me because I was willing to play the role nobody else wanted." Her honesty struck him harder than expected. For a brief moment, Alexander felt the mask slipping between them, but he forced it back into place. "Remember our agreement. Appearances only." Her lips curved faintly, though it was not a smile. "I remember. But you should also remember that I never asked for more." The storm outside roared louder, and Alexander turned away, unsettled. He could not explain why her quiet strength bothered him more than her obedience would have. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between them only deepened the tension. At public events, she carried herself with elegance, drawing attention not through extravagance, but through poise. Guests whispered about her dignity, about how she seemed untouched by the wealth surrounding her. Alexander overheard it all, though he pretended not to care. Behind that pretense, however, something had begun to stir. He noticed the way she stopped to thank the staff, the way she crouched to speak kindly to a child at a gala, the way she kept that old sketchbook as if it were more valuable than diamonds. She was nothing like the woman he expected to despise. And though Alexander told himself again and again that this was only a contract, only a temporary cage, he found himself watching her when she did not notice. He found himself wondering what secrets hid behind those steady eyes. He told himself it was irritation. He told himself it was suspicion. But deep down, he knew it was something else. Something he was not ready to name. The first crack in their fragile arrangement came during a charity auction hosted by the Reed Foundation. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers, the stage lined with priceless artwork, and reporters crowded in to capture every smile. Alexander arrived with his wife on his arm, his expression as polished as the black tuxedo he wore. To the cameras, they were the flawless couple, but perfection is difficult to maintain under scrutiny. When the bidding began, one of the guests, a rival businessman, leaned toward Alexander's wife with a sly smile. "I must say, Mrs. Reed, you seem far too gentle for this world of contracts and boardrooms. Are you truly suited for such a powerful man?" His words carried just enough venom to sting. The cameras caught her reaction instantly. She held her composure, but her silence told a different story. Alexander's jaw tightened. Without thinking, he placed a protective hand over hers, his voice cutting through the room. "My wife is stronger than anyone in this hall will ever know. Do not mistake grace for weakness." The reporters scribbled furiously, flashes bursting around them. To the audience, it looked like devotion. To Alexander, it felt like instinct, and that unsettled him more than the insult itself. That night, however, the headlines told a different tale. Perfect marriage or perfect illusion? Why does the Reed bride never speak? Is this union just for business? The photos showed Alexander's fierce defense, but they also highlighted her nervous stillness, her silence beneath the weight of expectation. Back at the mansion, the fallout was immediate. His father summoned him to the study, slamming the newspaper onto the desk. "This is unacceptable. One more scandal, and the merger will be in jeopardy. Control your wife." The words ignited something Alexander did not expect. For years he had obeyed every demand, sacrificing his own freedom for the company's survival. But tonight, as he looked at the headlines and then at the memory of her quiet dignity, something shifted. He answered sharply, "She is not a liability. She is my responsibility, and I will handle it my way." When he returned to her, she was sitting alone on the terrace, the city lights sprawling beneath them. She did not rise when he approached. Instead, she asked softly, "Am I ruining everything for you?" For the first time, Alexander struggled to find his usual cold reply. He saw the uncertainty in her eyes, the weight she carried silently every day. He lowered himself into the chair beside her. "No, you are not ruining anything. The truth is, you are the only part of this marriage that feels real." She turned to him, startled, as if she did not believe what she had heard. The silence between them stretched, no longer heavy with distance, but charged with something neither of them could name. Yet just as the air began to shift, the storm outside their walls grew louder. Reporters camped at their gates. Investors whispered doubts in private meetings. The board demanded answers. Their perfect fade was collapsing, and with it, the fragile line between contract and something far more dangerous, genuine feeling. And deep inside, Alexander Reed knew the moment of truth was drawing closer. The contract they had both signed was no longer just ink on paper. It was a wall, and that wall was beginning to break. The storm of scandal did not fade quickly. For days, the estate was surrounded by flashing cameras, and every newspaper speculated about the nature of their marriage. Alexander withdrew deeper into work, convinced that if he ignored the noise long enough, it would pass. Yet one evening, as he returned home past midnight, he discovered something that unsettled him far more than the headlines. The mansion was quiet except for the faint sound of coughing. He followed the noise to the small garden room at the back of the house, a place he rarely entered. There she was, seated on a bench beneath the dim glow of a lamp, her face pale as she tried to steady herself. Her sketchbook rested open on her lap, though her hands trembled too much to hold the pencil. For the first time, Alexander saw her without the veil of poise she wore in public. She looked fragile, almost breakable. Alarm jolted through him. "Why did you not tell anyone you were ill?" he demanded. She startled, her eyes wide, then quickly shook her head. "It is nothing, just exhaustion. I did not want to cause trouble." The word stung him more than he expected. Trouble? Did she really think of herself that way? He took the sketchbook gently from her lap and closed it. "You are not trouble," he said, his voice lower than he intended. "You are my wife. Even if this marriage began as a contract, Your well-being is not a clause to be negotiated. She blinked at him, as if hearing those words unsettled her more than her illness. After a long pause, she whispered, "You make it sound like you care." Alexander looked away, struggling with emotions he had spent years locking behind iron walls. He forced himself to meet her gaze again. "Maybe I do." The silence that followed was different from before. It was not heavy with distance, but filled with an unspoken shift. He helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed, and escorted her back inside. The simple act of guiding her through the hallway, his hand supporting her arm, felt more intimate than any kiss they had ever staged in public. Later that night, as she rested, Alexander found himself lingering by her door. He had always believed strength came from control, from keeping emotions locked away. But watching her fight silently against exhaustion, he realized that true strength looked nothing like what he had been taught. It was quiet. It was gentle. It was hers. The next morning, when the staff brought her tea, Alexander noticed the way she thanked them by name, the way she smiled despite her fatigue. She carried herself with dignity, even when she had nothing to prove. He began to see the outlines of a woman far beyond the contract, a woman who did not belong to boardrooms or scandals, but to a life of simple, genuine kindness. And for the first time, Alexander Reed admitted to himself that he wanted to know her beyond the agreement. He wanted to learn the secrets behind the sketchbook, the reasons behind her calm strength, the history behind her eyes. What had begun as a cage was becoming something else entirely. And though he could not say it aloud, he knew that the woman he once saw as a stranger was now the only truth in a world built on lies. The calm that had settled between them was fragile, like glass resting on the edge of a table. It shattered the moment Alexander began to question the truth behind his wife's identity. It started innocently enough. One morning, while preparing for another corporate event, Alexander noticed her sketchbook left open on the terrace. Inside was a half-finished drawing of a small bakery storefront, the kind of humble place far removed from the marble and crystal halls of the Reed estate. Beneath the drawing were words written in a neat hand. Home. The word caught him off guard. It did not align with the polished Monroe background he had been told she came from. Intrigued, he began to notice more details. She knew the names of the kitchen staff's children, but never mentioned her own family. She walked through lavish parties with grace, but her eyes softened only when she passed ordinary people on the street. One evening, determined to uncover the truth, Alexander confronted her. He placed the sketchbook on the table between them. "This does not look like Paris or Milan," he said evenly. "This looks like a corner shop from a small town. Who are you really?" Her hands froze around the teacup she was holding. Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of secrets. Finally she whispered, "I am not the Monroe daughter you think I am. I was never meant to stand in that church as a bride." Alexander's chest tightened. "Explain." Her voice trembled, but her eyes did not waver. "The Monroes promised a daughter for the alliance, but their eldest refused. Rather than risk the deal, they brought me in. My family owed them a debt, and I was the payment. I agreed because it meant my younger brother would be given a chance to study, a chance at a future I never had." The revelation hit Alexander like a blow. Rage surged, first rage at the deception, at being manipulated into binding himself to a stranger, at being treated like a pawn in the endless games of power. "So you lied to me. You let me believe this was real when it was nothing but a charade." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not beg. "I never lied. I signed the papers like you did. I stood beside you because it was required. But every moment since then, every act of kindness, every word, that was me. Not a contract, not a lie." He wanted to look away, to cling to anger, but her voice cracked on the last words and it pierced through his fury. For the first time, he saw not a conspirator, but a woman trapped by the same system that had bound him. He turned from her, fists clenched, his breath uneven. The empire demanded loyalty, demanded sacrifice, but this was betrayal on a level he could not accept. Yet even as he told himself to walk away, he found himself frozen, because the truth was clear. If she had wanted power, she would have claimed it already. Instead, she lived quietly, humbly, almost invisibly. That night, Alexander did not sleep. He paced the dark halls, the echo of her confession replaying in his mind. She was not who she claimed to be. She was not who the world believed she was. But she was also not the enemy. The question haunted him. Was he truly angry at her, or at the chains of the world that had forced both of them into this charade? By dawn, he knew only one thing with certainty. The truth had been revealed, and nothing between them would ever be the same again. The secret could not remain hidden for long. Power has a way of unearthing truth, and in the circles of wealth and influence, whispers spread faster than fire. Within days, the press caught hold of the story. Headlines blazed across every front page. Reed marriage a lie, bride not who she claimed to be. Photographs of her circulated, not with admiration this time, but with suspicion. Reporters camped outside the estate gates, shouting questions that echoed like accusations. Who are you really? Did you deceive the Reed family? Is this marriage a fraud? The scandal Alexander had feared most had arrived, but not in the way he imagined. It was not about failed affection or cold appearances. It was about betrayal, about deception, and it threatened to topple everything. Inside the boardroom, the pressure was relentless. The directors demanded answers, their voices sharp and unforgiving. "This is a crisis," one barked. "Our shareholders are panicking. The merger is unstable. You must cut ties immediately," another chimed in. "Annul the marriage. Denounce her publicly. Protect the company before it is too late." Alexander sat at the head of the table, his hands steepled beneath his chin, outwardly calm, inwardly torn. Every calculation told him to follow their advice. End it. Distance himself. Preserve the empire. But as their voices grew louder, another image rose in his mind. Her sitting in the garden, sketchbook trembling in her lap, confessing her truth not with arrogance but with fear and dignity. Finally, he stood, silencing the room. His words were deliberate, each one striking the board like a hammer. "You speak of her as if she were a liability. She is not. She is my wife. I will not disown her." The board erupted in protest, but Alexander had already made his decision. He left the room, his stride unshaken. That evening, with the estate surrounded by flashing cameras, Alexander stepped out onto the grand steps, his wife beside him. She looked fragile, the storm of attention pressing against her like a tide. For a moment, she seemed ready to collapse under the weight of it all. But then Alexander reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in front of the world. The crowd roared with questions, but his voice rose above them. "Yes, the woman beside me is not who you were told she was. She was not born into wealth, nor raised to play this game of power. But she is my wife. She has stood with me in truth and dignity when the rest of you only see contracts and deals. This marriage may have begun as an arrangement, but today I tell you it is real. I choose her." The cameras exploded with light. Reporters shouted frantically, desperate to capture every word. But for Alexander, there was only the quiet squeeze of her hand in his, the unspoken gratitude in her eyes. In that moment, the empire trembled, but his choice was unshakable. For the first time, Alexander Reed had acted not as an heir, not as a CEO, but as a man willing to risk everything for the truth of his own heart. The uproar from Alexander's public declaration did not die down. If anything, it grew louder. News outlets dissected every word. Business analysts speculated about the collapse of the merger, and investors demanded reassurance. Yet for the first time in his life, Alexander Reed did not care about the noise of the world. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. The following day, a press conference was arranged. The board intended it to be damage control, a final attempt to salvage the company's reputation. But Alexander had something very different in mind. He walked into the grand hall with his wife by his side, her presence a quiet contrast to the chaos swirling around them. The table at the front was stacked with microphones, the walls lined with cameras. As soon as he took the podium, the questions came in a flood. Is the marriage valid? Will the merger survive? Was this deception deliberate? Alexander raised a hand, silencing the room. His voice was steady, clear, carrying the weight of a decision that had already been made. You have all heard the rumors. You have all seen the headlines. And yes, it is true. The marriage began as an arrangement. It was built on contracts, not choice. But what you do not understand is this. I will not allow ink on paper to dictate the worth of the woman standing beside me. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but he continued. This document, he held up the marriage contract, its pages bound and sealed, was meant to control us. It dictated our every move, our silence, our future. But I am done being controlled. With deliberate force, Alexander tore the contract in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the hall like thunder. Flashes exploded from cameras. Journalists surged forward. And the board members watching from the side paled with shock. He turned to his wife, holding her gaze in front of the world. From this moment forward, there is no agreement, no performance, no façade. There is only us. And I will stand by her, not because of obligation, but because of choice. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then the chaos erupted. Again questions shouted, cameras clicking, voices rising in disbelief. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the way she looked at him, eyes wide with tears she could not contain, her hand trembling as it reached for his. Alexander took her hand firmly, lifting it for everyone to see. "You want truth?" he declared. "Here it is. I love my wife. That is all the truth you will ever need." The press conference dissolved into frenzy, but Alexander no longer felt the weight of chains around him. For the first time, he was not protecting a company, a merger, or a family name. He was protecting her. He was protecting them. As they walked out together, hand in hand, the flashes of cameras followed them like fireworks. The empire's future was uncertain, but Alexander Reed knew this much with absolute clarity. He had broken free from the prison of contracts, and in doing so, had found something far more powerful than wealth-love chosen freely. The world outside the press conference erupted into chaos, but for Alexander and the woman by his side, it felt strangely quiet. The clamor of journalists, the flashing lights, and the endless questions faded into background noise as they stepped into the waiting car. For the first time since their marriage began, the silence between them was not heavy. It was peaceful. As the car pulled away from the crowd, she turned to him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "You just destroyed everything your family built. Why would you do that for me?" Alexander looked at her, his expression softened by a rare smile. "Because everything they built was a cage. You showed me what freedom feels like, and I would rather lose an empire than lose the only truth I have ever found." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but they were not of sorrow. For the first time since stepping into this arrangement, she felt seen not as a substitute, not as a pawn, but as herself. Days later, the media storm still raged, but the two of them no longer lived in fear of it. They moved quietly into a smaller residence, away from the towering estate, a place where the walls did not echo with judgment. There, she unpacked her sketchbook, placing it on a simple wooden table. When Alexander saw the familiar worn cover, he picked it up and opened it. Inside was the unfinished sketch of the bakery. She watched nervously, but instead of questioning, he said, "Let us finish this together. If this is home to you, then it will be home to me too." In that moment, the distance that had once defined their marriage disappeared. The contract was gone, the expectations dissolved. What remained was a choice they both made freely, side by side. One evening, as they walked hand in hand through the quiet streets, far from the marble halls and flashing cameras, Alexander whispered, "I thought I was trapped in an arranged marriage, but when you lifted your veil, I realized you were not my prison, you were my freedom." And beneath the glow of the street lamps, she smiled, leaning closer, her voice steady and sure. "Then let us never go back to cages. From now on, only us." Together, they disappeared into the night, not as strangers bound by a contract, but as two souls bound by choice, by truth, and by love that had finally found its way home.